How does a small collection of rebellious colonies turn into a global superpower? Well, that's the story of the United States. It's a history forged in conflict, in division, and constant reinvention. So how did it all happen? We're going to take a rapid-fire journey through the key moments that shaped the nation we know today.
All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to start before America was even a country, then jump into its revolutionary birth. After that, we'll look at its massive but very troubled expansion, how it was forged in 2 world wars, and finally, its rise as a modern superpower.
You know, to really get the story of America, you can't just start in 1776. You have to go way, way back. For thousands of years, this was a continent buzzing with a huge network of diverse cultures and really complex societies. It was a whole world that existed long before any European ships showed up. So get this, centuries before anyone was even thinking about a United States, you had the Mississippi culture building these incredible cities with massive earthwork mounds. And the Iroquois Confederacy, they had already set up a sophisticated democratic-style government. This was absolutely not an empty land. It was a continent with a deep, rich history all before 1492.
But the arrival of Europeans unleashed, well, a biological catastrophe. You see, the biggest killer wasn't guns or swords. It was invisible invaders, diseases like smallpox. The native peoples had zero immunity, and the results were devastating. Some historians estimate that up to 90% of the population was wiped out, just a staggering, unimaginable loss of life.
Now, the European powers who showed up all wanted something different. They had totally separate game plans. The Spanish were here for conquest. Think God, gold, and glory. The French and the Dutch, they saw a gold mine in the fur trade. But the English, they had a different idea. They came to stay, to build permanent settlements, all financed by wildly profitable crops like tobacco.
And those English settlements, they didn't just survive, they thrived. They grew into these busy, bustling colonies. But as they got bigger and more successful, so did the tension with their bosses back across the ocean in Great Britain. This was setting the stage for a massive revolutionary fight.
So what really lit the fuse for the American Revolution? Honestly, it all came down to money. Britain had just won a massive, expensive war fought all over the globe, the 7 Years' War. They were victorious, but they were also flat broke. To refill the treasury, they looked at their prosperous American colonies and thought, you guys can help pay for this.
And that one idea, no taxation without representation, that became the rallying cry. It wasn't just about the money. The colonists were absolutely furious that a parliament 3,000 miles away, where they had no elected officials, was making financial decisions for them. This was a core fight about their rights as Englishmen.
And things went from bad to worse really fast. It's like a domino effect. First, it's protests over a tax on paper. Then, those protests turn deadly when British troops fire into a crowd in Boston. In response, patriots dump a fortune in tea into the harbor. And Britain's response to that? A total military lockdown of Massachusetts. Each step pushed them closer and closer to the edge. By 1775, the talking was over and the shooting started. A year later, the colonies went all in, issuing the Declaration of Independence. But for years, winning was a real long shot. The tide really turned with a stunning American victory at Saratoga. That convinced France to join the war on America's side, and that alliance was the game changer. By 1783, it was official. The United States was its own country.
Okay, so winning the war was one thing. Building a country? That's a whole different challenge. The new nation immediately started looking west, hungry for more land. But every single new mile of territory just made a deep, violent crack running down the center of the country even wider.
I mean, talk about the deal of a lifetime. In 1803, with just the stroke of a pen, the United States literally doubled in size. Napoleon needed cash fast to pay for his wars in Europe, so he sold this enormous chunk of land to President Thomas Jefferson for an absolute bargain. The map of America was completely redrawn, just like that.
And what was fueling all this expansion? It was this incredibly powerful idea called manifest destiny. This was the belief that it was America's God-given right, its actual destiny, to stretch all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This wasn't just a political idea. For many, it was a divine mission. It's what justified things like the annexation of Texas and the war with Mexico.
But here's the huge problem. As America got bigger,
This massive fracture running right down the middle of it got deeper and deeper. The North was industrializing, building factories and running on free labor. The South was agrarian, and its entire economy, its entire way of life, was built on the backs of enslaved people. So with every new piece of land, the question was, will it be a free state or a slave state?
Eventually, there was no more room for compromise. The question had to be settled, and the result was the American Civil War, the deadliest war in the nation's history. In the summer of 1863, the whole thing came to a head over 3 brutal days in a little Pennsylvania town called Gettysburg.
For the South, Gettysburg was an absolute disaster. It was their big gamble, an invasion of the North, and it failed spectacularly. After 3 days of just unimaginable carnage, the Confederate Army was broken and had to retreat. The war would drag on for almost 2 more years, but everyone knew it. The tide had turned for good.
So the country pieces itself back together and moves into the 20th century. For the most part, it wanted to stay out of the world's messy problems. But that just wasn't gonna last. 2 devastating world wars were about to yank America out of its isolation and onto the global stage for good.
You know, in both World War I and World War II, the story starts pretty much the same way. America did not want to get involved. It took a direct punch to the jaw to get the U.S. into the fight. In World War I, it was the Zimmermann Telegram, a secret German plot to get Mexico to attack the U.S. And in World War II, it was, of course, the shocking, devastating attack on Pearl Harbor.
And the decades around these wars were, wow, what a roller coaster. You have the wild party of the Roaring Twenties, which comes to a screeching halt with the Great Depression. And the end of World War II brings victory, but also unleashes a terrifying new power on the world, the atomic bomb, kicking off a whole new age of global anxiety.
So when the smoke clears from World War II, the global landscape has completely changed. There are basically 2 heavyweights left standing, the United States and the Soviet Union. This rivalry would define the rest of the 20th century, creating a new kind of global conflict.
And just like that, the world split in 2. You had the West, led by the US and its NATO allies, built around democracy and capitalism, and you had the East, led by the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, united by communism. For nearly 50 years, these 2 sides faced off in a tense, high-stakes standoff we call the Cold War.
The Cold War wasn't a shooting war between the 2 superpowers, but it was fought in proxy wars, in an arms race, and even in the space race. But while all that was happening on the world stage, an equally important battle was being fought at home, as the civil rights movement pushed America to finally live up to its promise of freedom for all its citizens. And this whole era of superpower rivalry would eventually end, only to be replaced by a new kind of conflict after the shocking attacks of 9/11.
And that brings us pretty much to today. This whole long, complicated, often violent story, from revolution to civil war to world wars, it all leads to this moment. A nation that, for all its internal struggles and challenges, still has the world's most powerful military and its largest economy.
You know, if you look back at all of this, one thing is crystal clear. The story of America is a story of change, almost always forged in some kind of crisis. The country has been forced to reinvent itself over and over again, which leaves us with the big question, right? What's the next chapter going to look like? What will be the next reinvention?